This is a forecast looking ahead to 2035. It did not take into account what we've seen now, but a lot of what the report kind of lays out really doesn't always have that much to do with the U.S., and it's very important not to center the U.S. in everything that's about China. So I think we can still have a rather robust conversation about China independent of the U.S. Pierre, the first scenario is an unstoppable China on top of the world. In this scenario, you write, China solidifies its position as an indispensable global power, dominating key industries and supply chains while keeping its economy stable and technologically advanced. Expand on scenario number one for us.
Maybe it's an acceleration of what we're witnessing about disunion of democracies, leaving the field open to China to have its own policies, its trade surplus booming. It's really playing on the weaknesses of countries, especially on the trade front, but also on the climate front. If China is able to provide clean tech solutions to most countries, it will gain the support among this country probably. It's also playing on the, I have to again put the United States con in it, about on the United States moving away from the geopolitical scene, maybe China having a bit more of a security engagement, whether tangible or not. It's China with less barriers to its expansion. So it would be on the economic front, especially being able to export with an unsuccessful de-risking policy, I would say. And on the domestic front, I would be an acceleration of the autocratic system in place, thanks to technologies, thanks to tamed opposition, even more tamed opposition. So I would say that's my key take on this first scenario. Maybe François, you would add a few words on this one?
No, not really. I think this is the optimal scenario for Xi Jinping, of course. And it's really based on relative strengths and weaknesses and on the division of others. So it does factor in pretty much what's happening in the West. It's also something, by the way, that has happened before. Remember the ascendance of Japan, the book Japan as Number One in these days, the optimism of Southeast Asian nations in the 80s, and early 90s, people like Singapore, for example, who thought about really replacing the values of the West. So even before we talk about the new factors, it's clearly something that China has in its sights. I just want to stress, being on top of the world doesn't mean running the world. Doesn't mean taking up what you might call the West's burden. China's ideas about global governance are far less ambitious in terms of breadth and depth of this governance. Would leave aside a lot of issues. The difficulty about that scenario, and we'll come back to that for other scenarios, is that how do you preserve trade rules? Trade rules are necessary for China because it's a huge surplus export nation. So it needs to be protected from a lot of countercurrents, or starting with protectionism or with conflicts. How do you do that if you don't take charge of other areas of international life? The U.S. approach, the Bretton Woods approach, was an integrated approach. And that's not what China is really about if you go beyond ideology and the speeches.
Yeah, just a little footnote here on that one scenario, Cobus, just before I get to you. You wrote there, the trope when, quote, China rules the world remains a fantasy of self-deprecating foreigners. And so I guess you're not a huge fan of Martin Jacques and his 2009 book. Is that what I'm taking away from that statement?
Yes, it is.
A little bit of shade thrown his way on that one. Back in 2009, that was a pretty kind of like shocking book for people to read, when it was like China's going to rule the world and be the best at everything. And so here we are, I guess, 16 years later, and not quite as relevant today. Go ahead, Cobus.
Your second scenario is, also highlights like this kind of interesting kind of mix of where China does get some pushback, but not coordinated enough to really hold back its rise. And at the same time, there's still some semblance of a global geopolitical balance. I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit, and particularly around which particular issues do you think China might get more or less resistance from some of these countries?
Yeah, that second scenario is pretty much what I would call a muddled through scenario for China's rise. Not complete, facing obstacles and having to deal with some opposition and having to make compromises and willing also to make compromises, which, by the way, is an important question today that we must ask ourselves. But on the whole, it will also be a continuation of the recent trends pre-2025. And I think it would be the best that all former advocates of engagement and dealing with China, attracting them slowly to our own ways of behavior, not to mention our values, when that was the stated policy. The notion that it's a rational world and that we know what China's interests are and can therefore induce them to undertake actions that fit these interests and our own. There are strong points which might make this scenario more or less likely. A very strong point is that in this report, we're generally very gung-ho on China's capacities for innovation and technology. I wouldn't have written the same thing 5 years ago, but it's very clear that on a number of grounds, China is replicating the old Japanese MITI story, but on a scale that the Japanese could never envision.
And a speed, too, I think, a pace that they're going much faster than the Japanese.
And speed now, as we say, even now accelerating on a number of key developments. And it's a function of support, it's a function of market size, it's a function of the agility and ability of Chinese researchers, it's a function of everything that's been sucked in from outside into China. That was a stated policy ever since Deng Xiaoping got back into power. It predates Xi Jinping by far. And that's, of course, a huge argument. Hey, do you remember what Mr. Greenspan, chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, said during the Asian financial crisis? He said the Asian financial crisis, low prices, especially on chips and other things, would enable us to increase our level of living and productivity at almost no cost. And this is what part of the customers' market in other countries believes. The Chinese have been a factor of low cost and increased living standards. If you leave outside the employment question, if you leave outside the longer term security issues, security sometimes from very concrete dual use or cyber point of view, sometimes from the point of view of economic security, that is, if you have monopolies in certain sectors, at some point the monopolies are going to extract their price. The Chinese price would no longer be a low price, it would become a high price. So there is this hesitation, which for the time being favors China. I look at the US, I don't know whether Donald Trump is going to go beyond the 10% surtax. If he doesn't go beyond, since China has been in deflation for 29 to 30 continuous months and has had a degree of currency devaluation, can easily match those countervailing duties as it is matched now European countervailing duties on EVs. It's very tough to go beyond that, and going beyond is going to have a cost for consumers. How much voters will arbiter between jobs and the price at the stores? That's something that's not decided yet. So I think these are huge societal factors. I insist that some of them are beyond China's hold. They belong to us. They belong to the receiving markets. But it's an important issue. The other one, of course, but I don't want to be too long, would be how much you can have this imbalance between, let's say, relatively low level of consumption of China. I think we exaggerate the degree of stagnation in China, but still it's much slower structural growth overall. And this export boom and boom of certain sectors, how long that imbalance can prevail.
Okay, let's move on. Progressively, your scenarios get more and more depressing for China and get more and more bearish. So the third scenario is the end of China's economic and technology miracle. So moving on from the troubles that you talked about, François, to real, a collapse of its current, well, not quite a collapse, but just a real downgrade of its current status. You write, global partners impose coordinated restraints on Chinese technology acquisitions, trade surpluses, and market access. China remains a large, important economy, but experiences a relative decline in competitiveness and innovation. And certainly tied to this has to be factored in the demographic changes that are underway in China, which are going to put strains on the economy as well as the population continues to shrink. Pierre, talk to us about scenario number 3, which is getting progressively more depressing for the Chinese.
So first, I think it's again important to factor in why 2045, because it's the deadline for that the party has set for socialist modernization. So I think this, in any scenarios, will be achieved. There's a subset of all criteria. So it's definitely pessimistic for China, but it's not critical for China. It will have modernized, it will have achieved a certain level of development undeniably. So it's not a recession, or it's not a complete explosion of the Chinese model. It's more an alignment of hurdles and barriers which would have made Chinese path more strained. On the domestic front, as you mentioned, definitely the demographic issue would have start to be an issue. On top of this, maybe this time the low consumption would have pushed the regime to rethink its economic model of growth. Because at the international level, as you were mentioning, you would expect a bigger push from countries, developing countries, but also emerging economies trying to protect their own industries. So it's both the addition of domestic hurdles along with a pushback from the international partners. And what does the addition of these two components make is that possibly also at the regional level in terms of security or military, it would refrain Xi Jinping from maybe attempting military intervention or initiative. So of course we have Taiwan in mind, but maybe because the domestic weaknesses of the economy would tame Xi Jinping's temptation to launch a military adventurism that could only actually worsen China's situation. That's maybe the biggest impact of this. It's not only Chinese economic and technology impact, but also maybe a security restraint.
François, the fourth scenario is basically kind of a doomsday scenario in which there's a major conflict, possibly around Taiwan, as the report kind of specifies, which then, has a major kind of global economic fallout. Has the recent developments around Ukraine shifted, like how you think about what that kind of conflict might look like? I think in my own, background, like my thinking around the different kind of sides of a possible conflict like this was set kind of by Biden era kind of logics in some ways, like assumptions about a certain kind of Euro-American alliance, for example. A lot of that is now kind of up in the air. So I was wondering how you think about this scenario at the moment.
There are two ways that we could get to this, what you call the doomsday scenario, scenario number 4 of an outright and increasing the global conflict. One is because of overconfidence. That would be an outgrowth of scenario number 1. Xi Jinping feels he's really succeeded in overturning obstacles, in dividing people. He feels he has allies, and let's say, for example, a Russian success on the Ukraine front. And he feels, therefore, he can now challenge the US, since the US has backed away from outright conflict on other terrains. The US might back out of a Taiwan conflict. It's being talked about in the US. That means a lot of risk-taking, of course, because historically the US has been known to be unpredictable in terms of engaging or not in a conflict that it had not started. The other option would be, on the contrary, total insecurity on the part of Xi Jinping about himself and his regime, brought about by a sharp economic downturn. It's interesting that in the red lines that he has recently outlined to his outside partners, including the US, there is now what he calls the right of China for development, meaning don't put obstacles in the way of Chinese growth. And this is an important factor that might cause him, in the usual scheme for authoritarian dictatorships that move forward externally when they're challenged internally, to create the conflict around Taiwan. This is entirely possible. It's very hard, however, to predict. In particular, we've seen a bunch of experts who say it's going to happen sooner rather than later because there is a window of uncertainty in U.S. behavior. And the window of uncertainty, by the way, hasn't fully closed, as you noted, about the Trump administration. We'll see it when we believe it, but we are not seeing it yet. Or on the contrary, in a more traditional way, China needs more time. It's still building up its army. It hasn't really tested its army in many grounds, especially on the maritime front, and therefore it's going to delay and hope for the best in between 2027, shall we say, 2035. 2035 is really a milestone for two reasons. One, that we're really coming at the end of Xi Jinping's potential longevity in power. Either the succession will have taken place or it would become very much the number one topic of political strife in China among people at the top. And two, that's the moment when demography really hits. I'm always skeptical of quick demographic explanations because very often they jump to conclusions. Right now, the sudden and sharp drop in birth is something that might even be lessening Chinese costs rather than increasing them. But by 2035, of course, the situation will become drastically different. Xi Jinping has bet on automation and innovation to go over that issue. We can't be sure that he will have succeeded. So this number 4 scenario, it's not a purely Chinese factor that will lead to it, but it's something that if we want to be on the safe side, we really have to include. And it's not because we might feel overconfident that the Chinese PLA hasn't been tested in battle and might lose that it won't happen. There have been regimes that start wars that they lose.
Yeah, and just to your point about Xi Jinping's age, he will be 81 years old in 2035. And if you read his speeches, he has insinuated, although I don't know if he has directly stated, that he would like to see the reunification with Taiwan, or the unification as he calls it, in his lifetime. So that is another indication that that something may happen. But again, I just want to put in a corollary to your scenario, because there is no consensus in the United States today on whether to defend Taiwan. The United States is a highly fractured, broken society on public opinion. And remember, Taiwan is not a treaty partner like the Philippines or Thailand, Japan or South Korea or Australia. So there's no legal obligation on the part of the United States to defend Taiwan in the event that it is attacked. I mean, there's a legal obligation under the Taiwan Relations Act to provide military supplies for its defense, but not for the United States necessarily to defend it and to intervene. So there is a scenario where China does move on Taiwan, and there isn't the war that breaks out with the United States. The United States does what they're doing with Ukraine today, just to Cobus's point, and kind of says, well, that's the way it goes. That's just what happens. It's not our fight. And in that event, there may not be the cataclysmic response that you outline in scenario 4. What do you think of that?
Well, we're very much overwhelmed by events happening now.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, what creates this uncertainty. Facing Taiwan, for example, Trump has started a TSMC game, saying TSMC has got to team up with Intel, the ailing chip maker in the US, and build in the US, and you saw the Intel shares rising
and
immediately.
TSMC people did not respond well to that, by the way. I mean, they did not
Of
like
course,
that idea.
because if I was Taiwanese, I'd be looking at Ukraine and say, if I give up my crown jewels now, what will be the rationale for the US to defend us? And so, as far as I can tell, TSMC is not moving as the Trump administration would like it to do immediately. But yes, in the longer term, this is an important consideration. And also, you have to realize now that China is using all sorts of harassment and coercion tactics, which are aimed at winning without the actual war, by wearing down the opposition in democracies. And they can be quite confident, with what's been happening, that democracies can change their course if they're faced with conflict. After all, it's our number one issue in Europe about Ukraine. We don't really want to send soldiers there. If you ask people in terms of public opinion, nobody wants to die for Ukraine right now. It's the limit of our engagement. And any authoritarian regime will calculate that on that front it has an advantage over democracies because it can engage in a conflict and lose soldiers when it's tougher for democracies. So you're right. This is a new window that is opening. But to be frank, if I answer in a broader term, what's been happening about Ukraine must be raising more than eyebrows in Japan and Korea as well. Because
I was going to say what's happening in Europe is raising eyebrows because, like Germany and Europe, Japan and Korea have tens of thousands of U.S. forces stationed there. And the prospect of U.S. forces being pulled out, which Trump has said is one of his ambitions, would provoke, I think, a lot of concern in South Korea and Japan to maybe start developing their nuclear weapons programs.
I don't know how much he said that he would withdraw troops.
In the first term, he did. In the first term. And he wanted them to pay up or else he'll take them out.
That's right. No, that's a constant theme to which they are accustomed and they know how to deal with it. But the issue of leaving Europe to its own travails is indeed something in the Japanese and the South Korean mind. Right now, especially the Japanese, they think they can repeat what I call Shinzo Abe 1. The maneuver of, sweet talking Trump making very limited concessions, in fact, but in appearance, they're huge. And hoping for the best. I'm not sure this was walk them through the second term.
Pierre, I wonder if you could reflect a little on in these scenarios how Europe's own position in the world may shift. Like when we were like doing early analysis of the impacts of Trump on like the shifts under Trump, one of the things that we were pointing out was that it's the kind of breakdown of the Atlantic Alliance also shifts Europe's position in relation to Africa, for example, right? Kind of because it, if like a more self-dependent Europe, making these large kind of like shifts in defense and so on, also shifts Europe's position as a norm setter, as an aid provider, as all of these kind of traditional role that Europe has played. And it also raises some kind of important demographic issues as well. So how do you see Europe's relationship changing in relation to the global South? And how could that affect also like possible trilateral cooperation with China?
It would be does Europe still have a place at the table, and is its voice still heard? Tangibly, I think Europe is still associated. There's a colonial past factor which still factors in at this point. So it's how much Europe is still associated to this past, or does it manage to have a more transactional, balanced transactional relation with certain countries. It's rethinking its position, but I think it's both an identity crisis for Europe about what could it be its position in 5-10 years from now on. Will it be sidelined compared to the US or China? And specifically in relation with global South countries, I think there's still underestimated presence of both European development aid to many countries, but also trade relations. Whether you look at ASEAN or African countries, trade relations from Europe compared to Russia or China is still much stronger coming in from Europe. So that this footprints that won't evaporate immediately, even in the context of a more tense security or military relations. So it's what will be Europe's position? Will its voice still be heard? How much will it have to adapt its trade discourse and trade relations? And secondly, how much its offer will be interested compared to that of China, I would say. China will have more as good products and cheaper ones. So it's how to find which criteria to insert without alienating emerging economies and developing countries, I would say.
Okay, the report is China 2035, The Chances of Success, produced by the Institut Montaigne. Absolutely essential reading. No doubt about it. This is fascinating scenarios to kind of explore and think about the various, and they go into such detail on it that it really is such worthwhile reading. It was written by François Godement, Special Advisor and Resident Senior Fellow focusing on Asia and America at the Institut Montaigne, and also a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., and also Pierre Pinhas, a project officer in the Asia program at Institut Montaigne. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and for this fantastic report and for helping us better understand what some of the scenarios are looking out 10 years from now, which is a fool's game right now, given everything that's going on, but nonetheless really important for us to do. We appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Cobus and Eric. Thanks very much.